Welcome, dear listener. Yeah, thank you for joining us once again for another long and calming journey into the quieter corners of history, where the stories are told slowly and gently, not to excite, but to ease you into rest. So, before we begin, I would like to invite you to take a moment to support this channel, because if you truly enjoy these boring history videos made to help you drift peacefully to sleep, then please remember to like this video and subscribe so you will never miss the next one. And since we have listeners from so many different places, I would love to know from where you are listening tonight and what time it is where you are right now. So feel free to share that in the comments below, as it always warms my heart to see how this quiet corner of history brings together people from all around the world. And now, if you are ready, let us begin. In the quiet world of ancient Rome, long before the sun has risen high enough to warm the streets and rooftops, the first light of morning belongs not to the masters of the household, but to the slaves who must rise before all others, shaking off the heaviness of short, broken sleep and stepping into another day that will feel very much like the one before it, and very much like the one that will come after it. For life in servitude was a life of endless repetition, where every sound, every movement, and every task was already known, already expected, and already mapped out by custom and by command. The slave's day began in the cold stillness of dawn, when the lamps of the house had burned low, when the air carried a damp chill that clung to the skin, and when silence was broken only by the shuffling of other tired feet rising from straw, mats laid close together on the hard floors of cramped quarters, tucked away behind kitchens or beside storerooms, or sometimes below the house itself in shadowed cellars that never saw the sun. They rose without complaint, because complaint had no place in their lives, and they moved with the weary calm of people who knew that no matter how they felt, same duties waited, and the same weight of expectation pressed down. One by one they gathered themselves in the dim half-light, adjusting coarse tunics made of rough wool that scratched the skin and smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, the fabric not washed as often as the garments they would scrub for their masters. And they tied belts at their waists, pulled sandals onto calloused feet, and prepared their bodies to serve. The earliest tasks belonged to the household slaves, whose duty was to bring order to the sleeping villa or dummies before the masters stirred from their beds. Some went quietly to relight the embers in the hearth, crouching low and blowing softly until sparks took hold and small flames licked the kindling. For warmth was needed to prepare bread and porridge and to chase away the chill of early morning. Here, others made their way outside into the narrow lanes or into the courtyard wells to fetch the first jars of water, moving quickly but steadily, careful not to spill as they carried amphorae that weighed heavily against tired arms. The sound of water sloshing in clay jars was one of the first sounds of a Roman morning, and it was the slaves who made it. In kitchens, shadows moved as slaves arranged the implements for cooking, laid out utensils, and ground grain with heavy stone querns that required long, slow, circular motions, the rhythmic scrape echoing softly like the heartbeat of the household itself. Outside, in the fading night, other slaves tended to animals, feeding chickens with handfuls of grain, checking the pens of goats or pigs, brushing down mules or oxen that would later be used for transport or labor, all before the masters had even begun to stir. For those attached to urban households, the first light meant opening shutters, sweeping entryways, and preparing to greet the day as though the villa had never known disorder, as though the stillness of night had been perfectly undisturbed. Each movement was careful, practiced, unhurried, but without pause, because the rhythm of survival depended not on haste, but on constancy. The slave knew that failing to complete these tasks before the master's eyes opened could mean harsh words or punishment. And so the morning became a quiet race against time, though without the energy of a race, without the rush of competition. Instead, carried out with the solemn patience of inevitability. Mourning also meant attending to the personal needs of the master and mistress, preparing their clothes, laying out garments of linen or wool depending on the season, brushing cloaks, to remove dust, polishing sandals, and ensuring that when they woke, nothing would be lacking. For the slaves whose duty was to wait beside the door of the master's chamber. The early light brought a hushed stillness as they listened for the first stirring from within, cough, a footfall, a call, any sign that the master was awake and expecting service. To wait was a task as much as to work, for standing silently, attentively, was as much a part of their life as fetching water or grinding grain. The body grew accustomed to stillness, just as it grew accustomed to weariness, and the morning was filled with both. Beyond the city, in rural estates and farms, slaves who labored in the fields would rise with the same dawn. The air cool, the soil damp with the dew, and their first light was spent gathering tools, harnessing animals, and preparing to walk out into open land that stretched wide under the pale sky. These slaves carried baskets, hoes, or plows, their bodies already marked by years of labor, their hands hardened and their backs bent by repetition. And as the day's first tasks began, there was no conversation, no laughter, only the measured sound of footsteps on earth and the occasional low call of animals being led from their pens. Yet whether in city or countryside, the pattern was the same. The day began not with choice, but with necessity. And the slaves met it with the quiet acceptance that this was life as it had always been, and as it would always be. The first light of morning was not a time of promise or of renewal, but of obligation, a signal that the long line of tasks had only just begun. The faint glow on the horizon, the cool dampness of stone floors beneath bare feet, the smell of smoke beginning to rise from hearths, the sound of water being poured into jars and basins, the whisper of brooms brushing across tiles. These were the textures of a slave's morning, woven together into a tapestry of duty. And though each day repeated the one before it, though nothing truly changed except the passing of seasons, it was in this repetition that survival existed, in the simple fact of moving from one task to the next, from darkness into light, from sleep into labor. The first light of morning was always the same, a slow unfolding of chores, a slow awakening of the house, and for the slaves of ancient Rome, it marked not just the beginning of another day, but the quiet continuation of a life defined by service, where even the earliest hours belonged not to themselves, but to others, and where the only rhythm was the endless rhythm of work. Task by task, moment by moment, until night came again to offer brief rest before dawn returned, in the long rhythm of a Roman slave's day. After the first light of morning stirred them from sleep and set them to tending hearts and preparing kitchens, there came the steady, unbroken duty of fetching water, a task so ordinary, so constant, and so consuming of time that it defined much of the daily labor of servitude. For in a world without taps, without pipes leading into every home, water was life, and water was weight, and it fell to the hands of slaves to bring it in, jug by jug, from wells, fountains, and cisterns scattered through city streets or across farm estates. Each trip slow, each trip necessary, strip another strand in the woven fabric of routine that bound their days together without end. Imagine the quiet of dawn giving way to the sound of sandals against stone, the shuffle of tired steps carrying clay, amphory, or earthen jars, empty on the way out, heavy on the way back, and the path always the same, from the hidden courtyards of the household down to the communal fountains in the city squares, or across rough farm tracks to the estate's wells, sometimes even farther to springs that still gave fresh water after many had already drawn from them. Each journey was measured not in distance, but in weight. For, though the empty jar was light. The filled jar pressed against the arms and shoulders with an unyielding force, sloshing against the sides as the bearer struggled to keep balance on uneven streets or dusty paths. The body adapted to this burden, muscles learning to endure, hands growing thick with calluses from the rough edges of clay handles. Yet, no adaptation erased the strain, no repetition made the jars lighter, only the mind learning to accept that this was the rhythm of every day. The slaves who carried water did not rush, for haste risked spilling, and spillage meant scolding or worse, so the walk was steady, deliberate, a slow procession of burden and return, one jar at a time, one trip after another, until the household was supplied, until kitchens had enough for cooking, until masters had enough for washing, until baths and basins and animals had been provided for. And only then was the task set aside, though never truly finished, for the water would always run low again, and the path would always need walking again. In the cities, the fountains were gathering places, not for leisure, but for labor, crowded with slaves from many households, each waiting their turn, each balancing jars on shoulders or carrying them slung across backs, each watching the slow trickle of water filled the containers, each knowing that patience was as much a part of the task as the walk itself. There was little talk, for conversation risked distraction, and distraction risked delay, and delay meant returning too late to satisfy the demands of the household. Instead, there was the sound of water striking clay, the steady creak of wooden yokes used to balance jars across shoulders, the faint grunt of effort as each load was lifted once more for the journey back. In the countryside, the task was lonelier, the walks longer, 'cause fields, still damp with dew, or long paths shaded by olive trees, the jars sloshing rhythmically in time with footsteps, the world around seeming vast and empty compared to the city's crowded fountains. But the weight was no less, the repetition no less, the patience required no less. To fetch water was not a glamorous duty, not one sung of in poems or carved into marble reliefs, yet it was the quiet backbone of daily life, the invisible current that sustained households, kitchens, baths, gardens, and animals, all carried on the bent backs of the enslaved. The masters who bathed in basins of cool water, who sipped from cups filled at their tables, who admired the clear pools of their fountains, rarely thought of the journeys that supplied them, the endless footsteps, worn into stone and soil by those whose names were forgotten, even as their labor sustained the very fabric of Roman life. And yet, for the slaves themselves, each trip was a meditation of necessity, a silent acceptance of burden, for to resist was impossible, and to endure was survival. The sun rose higher as the trips repeated, shadows shortening, jars filled and refilled, arms aching, shoulders rubbed raw by the friction of carrying. But still the slaves walked, and still the water flowed, jug by jug, into the heart of the household. It was in this slow, unending rhythm that the slave's morning passed, until the task itself became not an event, but a state of being, the body moving almost without thought, the feet knowing the path, the arms knowing the weight, the mind quiet, resigned, subdued. The duty of fetching water was not a story of drama or adventure, but of continuity, of sameness, of the slow pulse of daily life carried out in silence, in repetition, in acceptance, jug by jug, trip by trip, until the day moved on to other labors, and the light of morning gave way to the full brightness of noon, in the slow unfolding of another Roman day. After the first light had pulled slaves from their straw mats, and after water had begun its weary journey from well to jar, from fountain to household, there came the gentle yet consuming duty of preparing. The morning fires, a task so ordinary in its rhythm, yet so essential in its necessity, that the life of the household quite literally depended upon it. For without fire, there would be no bread to eat, no warmth to chase away the lingering chill of dawn, no coals to heat the bath, no glow to light the shadows. And so the tending of flames fell to the slaves with a weight not of drama, but of inevitability, repeated morning after morning, day after day, till it became less a task and more a pulse within the larger heartbeat of servitude. To begin, a slave would crouch low before the hearth, where embers might still glow faintly from the night before. It's a soft red, hidden beneath a layer of ash, fragile but alive, waiting to be coaxed back into flame. And with slow breath, careful and steady, the slave leaned close, blowing gently across the surface until the dull glow brightened, until the tiny spark flared into orange, until thin tongues of flame began to lick upward from the charcoal, small at first, then stronger as bits of kindling. Twigs gathered from the courtyard, or splinters shaved from larger logs, were laid delicately across the coals, each piece placed with patience, so that the flame grew without smothering, without rushing, without faltering. When no embers remained, when the hearth had gone completely cold, the task stretched longer, requiring flint and steel, or a brand carried from another fire, still alive elsewhere in the house, or, in some cases, the long and exhausting labor of friction, wood against wood, spun and pressed until heat sparked life into the dry shavings. A process slow and unforgiving, demanding endurance, demanding calm. For frustration had no place in such work, only repetition, only the steady motion that, with enough time, coaxed flame into being. Once the fire caught, once it steadied, the slave's work only deepened. For the flame was fragile, demanding constant attention, requiring the laying of larger sticks, then heavier logs, each added with care, each adjusted so air might move freely, so smoke might rise through chimneys or vents, so the flame might remain alive for hours to come. Around this growing fire, other tasks unfolded. Pots placed nearby to heat water for the day's bread, iron pans set to warm oil, clay lamps touched to the coals so they might carry light into other rooms of the house, servants moving in quiet, rhythm around the hearth as the central source of life and energy, all revolving around the steady patience of one or two slaves whose entire morning was devoted to fire alone. The act of preparing fires was not confined to kitchens, for in the villas of wealthier Romans, braziers needed tending in bedrooms, coals needed carrying 2 baths, lamps needed lighting in corridors, each fire another point of labor, another place where smoke had to be coaxed into flame, where embers had to be maintained, where wood had to be supplied. Slaves moved from chamber to chamber with baskets of kindling, with clay pots of coals, with tongs and pokers, with arms darkened by soot and faces warmed by smoke, their movements silent, unacknowledged, yet always essential. To breathe life into the morning fire was to breathe life into the household itself. For without it, the day's meals could not begin. The rooms would remain in darkness. The baths would remain cold. And the routines of the masters would falter. A truth well understood by those who bore the responsibility. A truth that pressed down like weight upon their shoulders. Never voiced, never spoken, only carried in silence. The rhythm of fire-making became a meditation of patience, the quiet focus of leaning close, the steady breath across ash, the slow placing of wood, the waiting for smoke to curl upward, the small victory of flame catching and spreading, the larger satisfaction, not of triumph, but of relief. Knowing the task had been fulfilled once more, knowing the household would stir to life without interruption. Yet there was no celebration, no recognition, for success was expected, and failure was punished. And so the slave who coaxed flame from embers simply moved to the next duty, leaving behind the glow that others would enjoy, the warmth that others would claim. The body bore the marks of this task, hands roughened by splinters, arms darkened by soot, lungs filled with the acrid sting of smoke drawn in too close to the embers. And yet the task repeated without end, for fire never kept itself, never tended itself, never carried itself from one day into the next. It was a duty so ordinary that it disappeared into the background of Roman life, a task unseen yet always present, like the slow turning of time itself, like the rising of the sun or the cooling of the night. And so, in the dim hours of morning, while the city outside still stirred awake, while carts creaked along streets and birds began their calls, while neighbors unlatched shutters and shopkeepers prepared their stalls, within the walls of each Roman household, the fire was coaxed back to life by unseen hands, by tired hands, by patient hands, by slaves who gave the flame to others without ever keeping its warmth for themselves. Jug by jug, ember by ember, flame by flame, until the house glowed with heat and light once more, till the masters awoke to a world already prepared, already warmed, already made ready for their comfort. As though the fire had never gone out, as though the slaves who labored over it did not exist at all. Among the most unending and essential tasks that shaped the daily rhythm of a Roman slave's life was the grinding of grain, a labor so constant, so repetitive, and so demanding of both body and patience that it became one of the clearest symbols of servitude, for bread was the foundation of Roman diets, eaten by rich and poor alike, and every loaf that appeared on a master's table began first in the slow, deliberate turning of stone upon stone, grain crushed little by little into flour, beneath the steady weight of enslaved hands. In the kitchens of villas and in the courtyards of farm estates, the work began in the earliest hours, after fires had been coaxed into life and water had been fetched, when jars of grain were opened and measured out, their hard kernels spilling into shallow baskets, pale and dry, rattling softly as they were poured into the hollow of a quern stone. The quern was a simple but heavy tool, a pair of stones fitted together, the lower fixed and flat, the upper carved with grooves, sometimes round, sometimes shaped with a handle, the kind of instrument that demanded not speed but constancy, for it was not the strength of one motion that mattered, but the endurance to turn the stone again and again and again, hour after hour, until the rough grain was broken down into the coarse powder that could be sifted, kneaded, and baked. Slaves knelt before these stones, backs bent, arms straining, bodies swaying with the rhythm of the motion, their muscles learning to follow the circle without pause, without faltering, the scrape of stone on stone echoing softly in the enclosed spaces of kitchens or in the open courtyards, where dust rose into the air, clinging to the skin, to the folds of woolen tunics, to the hair, to the very breath. There was no end to the task, for households required bread every day, sometimes several times a day, and the supply of grain was endless, stored in great jars, measured carefully, and handed out with commands to grind until enough flour had been produced. The weight of the work grew not from its complexity, but from its repetition, the endless circle of the stone, the endless scraping sound, the endless pile of flour growing only slowly, reminding the slave that every minute of turning produced only a handful of powder, and yet the turning could not stop. Not until baskets were full, not until dough could be prepared, not until the demands of the household were satisfied. In wealthier houses, larger mills powered by donkeys, or even by teams of slaves harnessed like animals, took on this burden. The upper stones rotated by constant force, grinding faster, producing more. Yet even these devices demanded human presence, for slaves had to lead the animals, to feed them, to drive them forward, to gather the flour, to sift it, to repeat the cycle without break. And the monotony remained, only amplified by scale, as larger amounts of grain meant larger amounts of labor. For the individual slave, Grinding grain by hand was not just exhausting, but shaping. The body marked by the task, arms thickened by constant motion. Shoulders stooped from bending, knees hardened by kneeling on stone floors for long hours, palms rubbed raw by handles or worn smooth by years of contact. And still there was no recognition, no pause, no reward. Only the knowledge that once today's flour was ground and baked, tomorrow's would demand the same, and the day after, and the day after, without change. Grinding was a labor often assigned to women, whether enslaved within households or working in large groups on estates. Their lives measured not in events or in achievements, but in circles of stone, their days slipping by in the rhythm of turning, the rhythm of dust rising, the rhythm of flour gathering like pale sand against the edges of the quern. The sound of grinding filled Roman mornings, a low, steady scrape that carried from one courtyard to the next, as familiar to the city as the cries of vendors or the clatter of carts. A background hum of labor that sustained the very foundation of society, yet went unnoticed by those it served. The masters who broke bread at their tables, who dipped crusts into oil, who offered loaves to their guests, rarely thought of the hours of labor pressed into each bite, the fatigue stored in each crumb, the unseen endurance of the hands that turned stone by stone, grain by grain, into the food that sustained them. And yet, for the slaves, the task was inescapable, a duty so embedded in life that it blurred into identity. As though to exist was to grind, as though to serve was to turn the circle without end. The dust of flour filled their lungs, coated their hair, whitened their tunics, marked their bodies in ways that soap and water could not wash away, so that even outside the task, even in moments of rest, the presence of grinding remained with them, clinging to skin, carried in breath. The work shaped the passage of hours, slow and heavy, each rotation of the stone marking time more surely than any sundial. A clock of labor that measured life not in moments of freedom, but in repetitions of duty. To grind grain was to embody the patience of survival, for the task could not be hurried, could not be escaped, only endured. And so the slave bent to the stone once more. Hand steady, motion constant, body resigned, turning circle after circle, hour after hour, until enough flour lay ready for the bread that would carry the household through another day. And in that bread, unseen, unfelt, unacknowledged, was the weight of servitude itself, ground fine, stone by stone, into silence. After the long, slow labor of grinding grain, when baskets of coarse flour had been sifted and set aside, the next duty that fell upon the shoulders of Roman slaves was the baking of the daily bread, a task that stretched across the hours of every morning and carried within it the same endless rhythm of necessity as water fetching and fire tending. For bread was not merely food, but the constant foundation of Roman life, eaten at nearly every meal, offered to guests, distributed to workers, and even given to the gods in ritual offerings. And because of this constant demand, the labor of bread making belonged entirely to the enslaved, whose mornings were consumed by the quiet, unbroken repetition of mixing, kneading, waiting, shaping, and baking until the household was supplied, and the masters could sit down to their meals as though the loaves had appeared by themselves, as though no weary hands had labored for hours to bring them forth from flour and water and flame. The process began with the flour, measured carefully into wide, shallow bowls of clay or wood, the powder rising softly into the air like pale dust as it was poured, coating the skin, catching in the breath, before water was added slowly, jug by jug, trickling into the center, cool and heavy, darkening the pale grains as hands reached in to stir and fold, to bind the dry flour into damp clumps, the fingers working steadily, pressing and pulling until the mixture thickened into dough. Salt might be added if the master desired, or oil if the household was wealthy enough, or sometimes herbs to flavor the bread. But for most, it was simple, coarse, unflavored, meant to fill the stomach rather than delight the senses. And it was the slaves who bore the endless burden of shaping it. Kneading was the heart of the work, the part that consumed both strength and patience, for the dough had to be pressed, folded, stretched, and turned again and again. The weight of the mass growing heavier as it stiffened, the muscles of the arms and shoulders burning as hands drove into the dough, palms pressing firmly, fingers pulling it back, folding it over itself, only to repeat the motion endlessly, for as long as it took to smooth the rough edges, to draw the mixture into a uniform, pliant mass. The rhythm of kneading was slow, repetitive, and almost meditative. The body swaying forward and back, the arms falling into a steady cycle, the dough softening beneath the pressure, the sounds of pressing and folding joining the scrape of bowls, and the crackle of fire as the kitchen filled with the quiet symphony of labor. Hours could be consumed this way, for households required many loaves, and dough could not be rushed. It had to be worked until ready, and readiness was judged not by clock or measure, but by the feel of the mass in the hands of the one who shaped it. A knowledge learned through repetition, through experience, through the uncounted mornings when the same duty had been carried out without pause. Once kneaded, the dough was left to rest, covered lightly with cloth, set aside in corners of the warm kitchen where the air, heated by the newly prepared morning fires, would allow it to rise, slowly, gently, the yeast stirring to life, the surface swelling almost imperceptibly, the passage of time measured by watching the rounded mound expand, as though the dough itself breathed in silence. Slaves did not wait idly during this time, for while the dough rose, other tasks pressed in, sweeping, fetching, carrying, preparing vegetables or oil for later meals, but always returning to check the dough, to touch its surface, to know when it was ready. Once risen, it was divided into portions, shaped into rough rounds or oblong loaves, sometimes marked with simple cuts across the surface, sometimes pressed with seals to show whose household had baked them. For in large cities, loaves might even be sent to communal ovens or bakeries, where dozens of slaves worked together to supply entire neighborhoods. For households with their own ovens, the heat had to be prepared. Clay structures stoked with wood until they glowed with warmth, the interior walls radiating heat, the chamber ready to receive the dough. Slaves lifted the loaves carefully, arranging them with practiced hands, sliding them inside with paddles, watching as the raw dough met the heat, as the surface stiffened, as the faint scent of baking bread began to rise, filling the kitchen, filling the courtyard, carrying even into the rooms of the household. A smell that to the masters meant comfort and plenty, but to the slaves meant only another reminder of labor, of duty, of repetition. The baking itself took time, the slaves waiting by the oven, listening for the crackle of crust, watching for the browning of the surface, turning loaves when needed, adjusting coals, keeping the heat steady, never leaving, never resting. For bread could burn quickly, and a burned loaf could bring anger, punishment, or scorn, so vigilance was constant. One by one, the loaves were drawn from the oven, set up on boards too cool, steam rising faintly from their cracked crusts, the golden surface hiding the hours of labor pressed into them, hiding the sweat of hands that had kneaded, the ache of arms that had turned dough for so long, the patience of bodies that had carried the flour, fetched the water, tended the fire. Once cooled, the bread was carried into storerooms, stacked neatly in baskets, or set upon tables for immediate use, while smaller crumbs were gathered for servants or animals. Nothing wasted, every part consumed, every part accounted for. And yet, even as the last loaf was placed, the task was never finished, for the bread would be eaten within hours, the supply consumed, and tomorrow the same duty would return. Flour ground once more. Dough kneaded once more. Ovens heated once more, until the slaves themselves could not tell one day from another. Their lives marked only by the unbroken cycle of dough and crust, of labor and silence. To bake bread was not a story of triumph or joy, but a quiet endurance, steady carrying of necessity, a meditation in labor where each step led seamlessly into the next, where time itself seemed to stretch and fold like the dough beneath their hands, until day after day passed in the same rhythm, in the same repetition, in the same silence of servitude. When the bread had been baked and the loaves cooled, when the kitchen was filled with the mingling sense of warm crust, boiled grains, stewed vegetables, and sometimes the richer smell of roasted meats or fish, if the household was wealthy enough to afford such things, the next unending duty fell upon the slaves who served at the table, for it was not enough to prepare food. It had to be carried, arranged, presented, and delivered in ways that matched the dignity and status of the master's household. And so, the act of serving the daily meals was itself a long ritual of order and obedience, performed slowly, carefully, and with constant attention to detail, for the smallest error could bring harsh words or worse. The process began long before the masters sat to eat. For slaves first prepared the dining space itself, sweeping the floors, arranging low couches around tables, setting cushions in place, and ensuring that vessels of pottery, bronze, or silver were polished and free of blemish, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the soft light of lamps or open courtyards. Cups were rinsed and dried, pitchers filled with wine or water, oil lamps trimmed so that they would burn steadily without smoke, and a table set with small plates, knives, and spoons. Though most eating was done with the hands, everything was positioned with care, the arrangement dictated by custom, by expectation, by the unspoken rules of Roman domestic life that slaves had to learn and remember without fail. Once the dining area was prepared, the procession of food began, carried by hand from the kitchen to the table, dish after dish of steaming grains, baskets of bread, bowls of vegetables, trays of fruit, and sometimes platters of meats, each presented in order, each set down with quiet movements, no noise, no clatter, no sign that the server existed beyond the dish being offered. Slaves moved almost invisibly through the room, stepping softly, heads lowered, voices hushed. For the meal was the master's moment of leisure, and their presence was permitted only insofar as it supported that ease. Bread was sliced and placed near the hand of the master, wine mixed with water in proper measure, for to drink unmixed wine was considered harsh and unrefined. And so slaves poured carefully, measuring by habit, letting the stream of liquid fall without spilling, filling cups to the level expected, but never more. Other slaves stood ready to replace empty plates, to bring fresh dishes, to refill cups the instant they lowered, to wipe the table or the master's hands with cloth if required, to fan away flies in the warm season, or to bring water for rinsing fingers between courses. Every motion was practiced, repeated so many times that it became automatic, a performance of quiet efficiency where the body moved without thought, responding to the smallest gesture, the faintest look, the subtlest sign from those reclining at the table. The slaves themselves did not eat here, did not taste the food they served, for their meals came later, after the masters were satisfied. And so the sense of roasted meat, of seasoned stews, of fresh fruit filled their noses, but offered no nourishment, only another reminder of their separation, their role as invisible bearers of comfort for others. During larger gatherings, when guests were present, the labor grew heavier still, for then the household's reputation was at stake, and the service had to be perfect, the food plentiful, the wine flowing steadily, the entertainment uninterrupted. And slaves moved constantly through the dining hall like shadows, keeping the atmosphere smooth, hiding every strain, every effort, every sign of the endless work that went into maintaining the illusion of ease. Conversation flowed among the masters and their guests. Laughter rose, debate sparked, but the slaves spoke little, their silence forming the background against which the meal unfolded. Their bodies bent to the task of sustaining comfort without ever partaking in it. Even small moments, such as breaking bread for a child of the household, or carrying away bones from the table, brushing crumbs to the side, were performed with a steady patience, the repetition of duties learned from years of watching, years of practicing, years of knowing exactly what was required before it was asked. Meals stretched on for hours, especially in wealthy households. And so the labor of serving stretched with them. The slaves standing ready without rest, their eyes following every movement, their hands prepared for every task, their minds fixed on duty, never on themselves. When the eating was finished, the work did not end, for the clearing began at once. Dishes carried back to the kitchen, cups gathered, crumbs brushed from the floor, oil lamps extinguished or trimmed, couches rearranged, the dining space restored to order, as though nothing had ever taken place, as though the laughter and noise of the meal had left no trace behind. The kitchen filled once more with activity, washing and scrubbing, drying and stacking, pots scoured of residue, knives cleaned of grease, pitchers emptied and rinsed, cloths wrung out and hung to dry, until every surface gleamed once more, and the cycle was ready to begin again the next day. And through it all, the slaves moved in silence, their bodies carrying the memory of each small task, their arms heavy from lifting, their backs sore from bending, their hands red from washing. Yet the work was never theirs in name, never acknowledged, beyond the expectation that it be done and done perfectly. Serving the household meals was not a moment of recognition, but an unbroken act of duty, a living rhythm of presence and absence, of being seen only in the instant that food or drink was offered and then forgotten, folded back into silence until the next course, the next cup, the next day. When the meals had been cleared and the household settled into its rhythm of the day, its quiet but unending labor of cleaning resumed, and among the most constant, most repetitive, and least celebrated tasks was the sweeping of floors for Roman houses, whether grand villas with mosaic pavements or simpler dwellings with packed earth and worn stone, required constant attention to remain presentable, and this attention fell always to the slaves, who carried reed brooms or bundles of twigs bound tightly with cord, moving from room to room with a steady rhythm, brushing dust, scraps, and refuse from one place to another, always bending, always guiding, always working toward a floor that appeared untouched by the passage of many feet. The task began at the thresholds, where dirt from the street collected, for the sandals of visitors and masters alike carried grit, pebbles, and fragments of leaves indoors, scattering them across the entryways and colonnades. And so a slave would stoop at the doorway, sweeping outward first to clear the heaviest accumulation, then inward, drawing the lines of dust into neat piles, careful not to leave streaks or marks across the polished stone. From there, the labor moved into the atrium, that open central space where family life unfolded and visitors were received, where the floor bore the marks of constant passage, the faint scratches of sandals, the spills of oil from lamps, the stray crumbs from meals, and the scattered husks from the day's work. Here the sweeping had to be especially precise, for the atrium was the face of the household, and a floor marred by dirt reflected poorly on the master. So slaves swept slowly, methodically, brushing every corner, driving grit from the patterned mosaics that displayed scenes of gods, animals, or geometric designs, careful never to damage the tiny tiles. For even the act of sweeping carried with it the weight of vigilance and caution. From the atrium, the rooms moved outward into the smaller rooms, the cubicula where members of the family slept, the triclinium where meals were taken, the storerooms where jars of oil, wine, and grain were kept, each room requiring its own pace, its own attentiveness. In the cubicula, floors were often dusty from disuse during the day, for these were sleeping quarters and not places of constant gathering. Yet the masters expected them to remain orderly, free of dirt, the bedding arranged neatly, the air kept fresh. In the triclinium, remnants of meals clung stubbornly to the ground, breadcrumbs worked into cracks, drops of wine staining the stone, grease smudges pressed by careless feet. And here sweeping was not enough, for slaves sometimes had to scatter sand across the surface to absorb oils before brushing it away, a technique passed down through practice, learned through repetition. One of many small skills that kept the household presentable, yet went unnoticed by those it served. In storerooms, sweeping was heavier, for dust and cobwebs gathered thickly. Mice left droppings, grains spilled from broken jars, and the slaves bent low, sweeping thoroughly, ensuring that food supplies were protected from pests and decay, though they themselves rarely tasted these stores in abundance. The work moved steadily along the porticos and peristyles, those open colonnaded walkways that framed gardens or courtyards, where wind carried leaves and petals, where rain left mud that dried to dust, and here the sweeping was constant, for these were transitional spaces, places where outside met inside, and the floors bore the ceaseless traffic of sandals and bare feet. A slave would pass through slowly, brushing leaves into piles, scattering water on dry dust to keep it from rising into the air, smoothing the surface so that it looked clean, but never calling attention to the labor itself. And still the task did not end, for kitchens required daily sweeping to keep the ash from the hearth from spreading across the floor, to gather the fragments of bone and vegetable peel that fell during food preparation, to drive away insects that gathered where crumbs were left too long. Here the air was always thick with smoke, the floor uneven with wear, and sweeping felt endless. For as soon as one pile of ash was carried away, another scattered from the fire. The lavatories, too, required attention. For though the Romans had systems of water and drainage, the floors grew slippery, waste and water mingled, and slaves bore the unpleasant duty of cleaning them, sweeping, scrubbing, carrying away filth, all done quietly, with no expectation of thanks, for cleanliness was assumed to exist naturally, though in truth it came only from their ceaseless labor. Sweeping extended even to the staircases and upper floors, where dust gathered along steps and landings, where cobwebs stretched between beams. And so a slave climbed with broom in hand, balancing carefully, brushing down the steps one by one, descending again to gather the piles into baskets or carry them outside. And when the day's sweeping was thought complete, when every room had been brushed, when every pile of dust had been gathered into clay pots or carried into the street, still the work could begin again, for footsteps never ceased, wind never stopped carrying grit indoors, meals left new crumbs, lamps spilled fresh drops of oil, and the floors demanded constant care, as if mocking the effort that had just been spent. The act of sweeping was repetitive, quiet, and exhausting, a labor that bent the back and numbed the hands, yet it was also strangely steady, a rhythm of bristles against stone, a soft, rasping sound that filled the silence of empty rooms, that marked time not in hours but in strokes, one after another, till the body moved without thought, till the sweeping itself became a kind of endless meditation, broken only by the sudden sound of a master's call or the interruption of a new mess to be cleared. And so, room by room, day after day, the slaves swept, their movements smoothing the traces of life from the household, erasing the footprints, hiding the dirt, creating the illusion of effortless order that masters and guests expected to find, never thinking of the bent backs and weary arms that made it possible. Among the countless tasks that filled the lives of Roman slaves, few were as demanding in both strength and endurance as the washing of garments. For clothing in the ancient world was far more than mere necessity. It was a sign of status, wealth, and dignity, and thus it was expected to be kept as clean and orderly as possible, though the methods by which such cleanliness was achieved were laborious, unending, and often unpleasant, and always carried out by the hands of those who owned nothing themselves. To imagine this task, one must begin with the garments themselves. Simple tunics, of course, wool worn by the poor, or finer dyed fabrics of linen and silk worn by the wealthier classes, cloaks to keep away the chill of night, and sheets of cloth used within the household, all of which collected dirt, sweat, oil, gained stains from daily living in a city where dust from unpaved streets, smoke from cooking fires, cane, and the refuse of crowded neighborhoods seemed to cling to every surface. Unlike in the modern age, there were no soaps as we know them, no mechanical means to wash and rinse, and no quiet conveniences, but instead a system of labor that relied upon water, human effort, and one of the least appealing but most effective agents available to the Romans: stale human urine, collected in jars at public places and brought to the laundries, known as fullaniki, where slaves worked in conditions that were harsh and foul-smelling, their bodies bent and hands raw from squat. Endless scrubbing. The process began by carrying the soiled garments to the fullery, often located along busy streets where large vats and tubs were arranged, filled with mixtures of water and urine, the ammonia acting as a cleanser that broke down oils and dirt clinging to the fabric. And it was here that the slaves stepped into the vats, barefoot and bare-legged, pressing and stomping upon the clothes as though treading grapes, working them rhythmically, twisting them underfoot until the liquid soaked through every thread. The stench was overwhelming, lingering in the nostrils and clinging to the skin. But slaves endured, knowing there was no escape from the task, only a continuation of it. For the garments of masters and their households could not be allowed to appear unkempt, and so the washing continued day after day, cycle after cycle, in air thick with the sourness of ammonia. Once garments had been trodden and pressed sufficiently, they were lifted heavy and dripping from the vats, their weight doubled with water. Slaves hauled them to rinsing basins, where clean water was poured over them, often drawn and carried jug by jug from nearby fountains or cisterns. And here another round of labor began, for rinsing was done by hand. The garments slapped against stones or beaten with wooden paddles, again and again, until the sharp odor began to lessen, and the fibers released the dirt that had been trapped within them. It was slow work, repetitive, requiring endurance as much as skill, for wool was thick and absorbed moisture greedily, making it heavy to handle, while linen, though lighter, demanded careful handling lest it tear, and finer fabrics dyed with costly pigments needed extra care to avoid fading. A responsibility placed on slaves, though they gained no benefit from the beauty they preserved. After rinsing came wringing, and this was among the most physically taxing steps. 4 heavy garments had to be twisted tightly, water pressed out by the strength of arms and shoulders, sometimes by 2 slaves working together, the liquid streaming from the fabric and rivulets onto the floor before garments were shaken out and prepared for drying, in courtyards, on rooftops, or within the open spaces of the fullery. Lines were strung or racks erected, and slaves spread the garments to dry in the open air, arranging them so that breezes could carry away the moisture, checking them often, turning them to prevent mildew, and ensuring that the weight of wet cloth did not cause seams to stretch or fibers to warp. Drying could take hours under the warmth of the sun, and during this time, slaves moved between tasks, preparing fresh vats, tending to garments already drying, or working on additional clothing brought in by customers who paid the fullest for. Their services for laundries served not only private households, but also the broader needs of the community, meaning the labor of washing extended far beyond the needs of a single family, touching the garments of merchants, travelers, and officials alike. Yet the process did not end with drying, for Roman households expected garments to be whitened and brightened, particularly tunics and togas. And so, another stage was undertaken, involving substances such as fuller's earth, a type of clay used to absorb oils and restore brightness, or sulfur fumes to bleach fabrics. And here again, slaves labored, rubbing powders into cloth, laying garments over racks in small enclosed spaces where sulfur was burned, the smoke stinging eyes and throats, yet thought necessary to create the gleaming whiteness that symbolized Roman respectability and purity. And still more steps followed, for garments had to be brushed once dry, smoothed with stones or metal tools, folded neatly, sometimes even pressed beneath weighted boards so that they appeared crisp and well kept when returned to their owners. Each stage demanded patience, strength, and attentiveness, yet the work remained invisible to those who wore the results, who walked confidently in gleaming tunics and spotless togas, their status affirmed by the labor of slaves whose own tunics were often threadbare, stained, and seldom given the same care. The act of washing garments was thus not only physical, but symbolic, for it reminded slaves daily of their position. They preserved beauty and dignity for others, while their own hands grew rough. Their lungs burned from fumes, and their bodies were consumed by work. The rhythm of washing was unending, garments piling up in corners, vats needing refilling, water requiring endless hauling, feet stamping in foul-smelling tubs, arms twisting sodden cloth until they ached. Yet the labor unfolded with a kind of steady inevitability, each motion flowing into the next. The day measured not in hours, but in garments cleaned, the sun marking progress as shadows shifted across the fullery floor. And at the close of the day, when garments had been dried, folded, and carried back to their owners, when the vats had been emptied and scrubbed, when the air at last began to clear of its pungent odor, slaves rested only briefly, knowing that the following day would bring the same burdens, the same garments soiled once more, the same labor repeated without end, for in Rome the dirt never ceased. The garments would never clean for long, and the work of those bound to wash them was never truly finished. Among the daily responsibilities of slaves within a Roman household, the care of animals was both constant and essential, for the well-being of creatures, great and small, directly influenced the comfort, status, and survival of their masters, and so it fell upon slaves to ensure that every beast, whether humble or noble, was fed, watered, groomed, and kept in proper condition. A task that stretched from dawn until night and carried with it countless details, from the clucking of hens in their pens to the stamping hooves of horses in their stalls, from the bleating of goats tied near the garden to the lowing of oxen out in the fields. The day for the animal keepers began with the first light, when the household stirred and the creatures, restless from the night, called out for attention. And slaves moved quickly to each corner of the estate or urban domus where animals were housed, carrying buckets of water drawn from cisterns or fountains, filling troughs and bowls, their arms and backs aching from repetition, yet without pause, for the creatures could not be neglected, not even for an hour. Chickens required grain scattered across the ground, their wings flapping wildly as they pecked and squabbled, while ducks and geese needed access to basins of water where they could dip their heads and clean their feathers. Hand to pigs, always, loud and demanding, had to be fed scraps from the kitchen, roots pulled from the soil, or fodder mixed with water, their snouts rooting greedily in the trough until the food disappeared. Beyond the smaller animals, sheep and goats required particular care, driven out of their pens to graze upon patches of grass or fields beyond the villa. Their movements guided by the steady hand of a slave carrying a stick, calling out to keep them from straying while watching for signs of sickness. For disease could sweep through a flock swiftly, leaving ruin behind. The goats, in particular, were prized for their milk, which had to be drawn daily, the act requiring patience as the animal shifted and protested. And the slave crouched low, squeezing and collecting the liquid into clay vessels, careful not to spill, for every drop was precious. Cows, too, demanded milking, their larger size and greater yield bringing more strain to the arms and hands of the one performing the task, while their massive bodies required strong fencing and constant cleaning of stalls, for dung accumulated quickly, filling the air with odors and drawing flies that had to be swatted away endlessly. Horses, however, were among the most valued of the animals, symbols of wealth and power, kept sleek and strong, their coats brushed until they gleamed, their manes combed, their hooves checked daily to avoid cracks or stones lodged within, for a lame horse could mean loss in trade, in travel, or in battle, and thus slaves labored to maintain them in perfect condition, hauling bales of hay, mixing mash of grain and water, rubbing them down after exercise, and cleaning their stalls with shovels and baskets, replacing soiled straw with fresh. Dogs too, though often companions to the household, were still cared for by slaves. Fed bones or scraps, trained to guard entrances or assist in hunting, their barking a constant background to the work of the day, while cats, though largely self-sufficient, were tolerated for their usefulness in keeping mice from the grain stores, and thus their presence too fell within the responsibility of slaves, who ensured they were not driven away. Beyond the domesticated animals lay the beasts of burden, donkeys and mules. Strength carried loads of water, wood, and stone, whose endurance made them indispensable to the functioning of both household and estate, and yet their care required endless effort, saddles checked, sores tended, harnesses repaired, and bodies washed down after long days of labor beneath the sun. To neglect them was to risk losing the very engines that sustained daily life, and so slaves treated them with constant attention, though not out of affection, but out of necessity imposed by their masters. The tasks repeated day after day, yet always bore new challenges, for animals fell ill, suffered wounds, or became restless, and it was the slave's duty to notice early signs, to clean a cut, to bind a leg, to apply ointments made from herbs, or to report more serious conditions to those above, though the responsibility lay squarely on the shoulders of those who worked most closely with the creatures. Even at night, the labor did not cease, for animals could not be left unattended. Predators prowled, thieves lurked, and sudden storms could frighten the flocks or damage pens, requiring slaves to rise from their bedding and attend once more to creatures bleeding, whinnying, or bellowing in distress. The rhythm of caring for animals was as unyielding as the rhythm of grinding grain or fetching water, and it tied slaves not only to the needs of their masters, but to the beating hearts of the creatures themselves. For the health of the animals meant wealth, food, and reputation for those who commanded, and unending toil for those who served. Yet, in the stillness of dawn, as the rooster crowed, or in the fading light of dusk, as sheep were gathered back into their pens, there was a strange constancy to the labor, a cycle that repeated without variation, each day a mirror of the one before, the smell of hay, dung, and animal sweat clinging to skin and clothing, the sounds of hooves, wings, and voices of beasts echoing across the household. It was work that demanded strength of body, quickness of hand, and attentiveness of eye. Yet it was work that earned no reward, no thanks, only the continuation of survival, both for the animals and for the masters they served, while the slaves, themselves, bound to the endless care of creatures they did not own. remained unseen, their labor absorbed into the quiet hum of Roman daily life. Their presence acknowledged only when absence or neglect brought trouble. And so the care of animals stretched on, season after season, as unchanging as the cycle of sun and moon, as necessary as the breath of those who depended upon them, and as invisible as the slaves who made it possible. Working in the fields was among the most grueling yet indispensable labors performed by slaves within the Roman world. For it was through the soil that the lifeblood of the household, and indeed the empire itself, was drawn, whether in wheat and barley that filled the granaries, in olives pressed for oil, or in grapes destined to become wine. Each task demanding relentless toil under the open sky, from dawn until dusk, with no shelter from the sun in summer, nor from the biting chill in winter. The day began early, often before the first light had fully risen, when overseers roused the slaves from their straw pallets and marched them to the fields with tools slung across their backs, wooden-handled hoes, iron-tipped plows, baskets for carrying stones, and ropes for hauling loads. Their bare feet or crude sandals soon caked in mud or dust, depending on the season. The soil itself was both a master and an enemy, heavy and unyielding when wet, cracked and stubborn when dry, demanding the steady swing of hoes to break it apart, the guiding of oxen to drag plows through its heart, the endless pulling of weeds that threatened to choke the young shoots, and the scattering of manure hauled from stables to fertilize the ground. All of it done with aching muscles and blistered hands, the rhythm of the labor dictated not by the will of the worker, but by the demands of the land and the commands of the overseer, whose watchful eye punished any who slowed their pace. Planting was a season of hope, but also of strain, as slaves scattered seeds by hand, stooping and rising, step after step across wide plots of land. The repetition, numbing yet crucial, for a poorly sown field meant a poor harvest and wrath from the master, while irrigation demanded careful tending of channels dug with sweat and maintained through constant clearing of debris, so that water flowed to each corner of the field without waste. Summer brought the ceaseless labor of weeding, stooped backs moving row after row, pulling, cutting, or burning the growth that competed with crops. The sun above merciless. The skin of workers burned and darkened, sweat-soaking tunics, until they clung like heavy rags, flies buzzing around faces. Yet the work went on, for neglect would ruin months of effort. Harvest time was both the busiest and the most backbreaking of all, as sickles flashed through golden fields of wheat, stalk by stalk, cut down and gathered into sheaves, carried on shoulders to carts, stacked into piles, and eventually threshed by trampling hooves of oxen or beating with flails. The chaff and grains separated in clouds of dust that choked the lungs and stung the eyes, yet demanded endurance until the last stalk was cleared. Grapes in the vineyards required their own form of attention, pruning in the early months, tying vines to stakes, guarding against pests and birds, then picking the swollen clusters during harvest. Baskets filled and carried to presses, where slaves stomped them underfoot or turned heavy beams to crush them, purple juice staining skin and tunics, stripping into clay jars that would later ferment into wine. A product central not only to Roman tables, but to trade and economy, all made possible by unseen laborers who worked tirelessly in rows of vines stretching to the horizon. Olive groves, too, provided no less strain, their trees needing pruning, their fruit shaken from branches with poles or gathered by hand, carried in sacks, pressed in heavy stone mills, turned by mule or man, the golden oil seeping slowly into jars, precious and valued, yet born from sweat and bruises. Nor was the field labor confined to crops alone. 4 stones had to be cleared, teaches dug, fences repaired, and roads leading into the estate maintained. the slaves working as though the earth itself were an ever-demanding beast that required constant feeding of their strength. The overseers lashed cracked often across the fields, striking those who faltered, reminding every bent back that mercy was scarce and discipline unrelenting, for the master counted not effort but results, measuring wealth in harvests and demanding nothing less than perfection. Winter did not bring relief, for even when fields lay fallow, slaves labored to prepare them for the coming spring, cutting brush, mending tools, hauling manure, grinding the remnants of stalks into the ground, their hands numb from cold, their breath rising in clouds as they swung heavy picks against frozen soil. Their bodies driven beyond comfort by the knowledge that idleness was punished as harshly as mistakes. The cycle of field labor was as eternal as the seasons themselves, each year repeating the same endless tasks, each season bringing its own burdens, yet each moment overseen and controlled, leaving no time for rest or reprieve, only the rhythm of tools striking earth, of voices calling commands, of animals straining in harness, of carts creaking under loads of grain or wood. The fields, vast and silent to the free-born eye, were alive to the slaves with the weight of their suffering, yet also with the rhythm of their existence, for the soil, indifferent and unyielding, consumed their labor and demanded it again, binding them not only to the land but to the unending cycle of Roman survival, where every loaf of bread, every drop of oil, every sip of wine carried within it the unseen imprint of their bodies, their sweat, their toil, their silence, woven into the wealth and comfort of others. And thus the fields, stretching endlessly beneath the Roman sky, stood as both prison and lifeline, shaping the days and years of those who labored upon them, their lives given over to the soil, their names forgotten, yet their work immortal in the very sustenance of empire. Hauling and carrying formed one of the most constant and exhausting burdens placed upon the backs of Roman slaves, a type of labor that was never truly finished, for every estate, every household, every farm, and every workshop required the endless shifting of weight from one place to another, whether that weight came in the form of wood for the fires, stones for the buildings, water in clay jars, food in baskets, tools in bundles, or harvests in great sheaves and sacks. And it was the slaves whose shoulders bent beneath these demands, day after day, year after year, until their bodies themselves became shaped by the strain of constant loads. From the earliest light of morning, slaves were commanded to bear burdens across courtyards and through narrow passages, to carry amphorae of oil or wine balanced precariously against their hips, to haul sacks of grain on their backs that pressed against the skin until it chafed and bled, to drag carts laden with firewood or straw when no animals were spared for the task. Their bare feet slipping in mud or grinding against rough stones, the overseer's eyes watching to ensure no load was set down before its destination was reached. The art of carrying was not gentle or leisurely, but exacting and brutal, for amphorae filled with liquid were awkward and heavy, their narrow handles digging into fingers until knuckles throbbed, their clay sides leaving bruises on forearms. Yet the slave was expected to walk steadily without stumble, for to drop such a vessel meant not only a costly loss to the household, but also lashes upon the back of the one who failed. Punishment added to injury, and humiliation added to exhaustion. Firewood hauling was another endless task, trees cut in distant groves needing to be trimmed, split, and stacked, then carried bundle after bundle into storerooms or kitchens, the rough barks scraping skin raw, the weight of damp logs biting into shoulders until each step felt as though the bones themselves might crack. And yet, when one bundle was dropped, another waited, and after that, another still. It's a cycle without end, because fires were always needed to cook meals, heat baths, or keep masters warm in winter. Water was perhaps the heaviest and most constant burden of all, drawn from wells or cisterns in large clay jars, carried by pairs of slaves slung from poles across their shoulders, or by individuals staggering beneath the sloshing weight. Each step a risk of spilling precious drops. Each journey repeated again and again, because the thirst of the household, the needs of the kitchen, and the demands of cleaning were endless, the labor turning arms and backs hard with use, though the muscles gained brought no freedom, only the ability to endure greater loads. In the fields, carrying was the partner to harvesting, for grain, once cut, needed bundling, lifting, and stacking. Each sheaf lifted 2 shoulders and borne across uneven ground to carts or threshing floors, backs bent and spines aching from the unrelenting rhythm of stooping, rising, walking, and unloading. While in vineyards, the baskets of grapes filled to the brim weighed down the carriers until their tunics were soaked with juice that seeped through cracks in the wicker, sticky and heavy, staining the skin purple, and still they trudged back and forth until the vines were bare. Stones and earth themselves were carried when construction or repair demanded it, slaves forming long chains from quarries or pits, each lifting blocks or baskets of rubble, passing them hand to hand, or carrying them in staggered lines, sweat dripping into eyes, dust coating throats, muscles quivering with fatigue. Yet the overseer drove them onward with harsh words or lashes, for the master's villa, the master's road, or the master's walls needed completing, and the bodies of slaves were the simplest tools for moving what was too heavy for wheels or animals. Inside the household, too, the labor of carrying never ceased. As furniture was shifted for banquets, tables set and reset, stools and couches lifted and arranged, dishes brought in on trays that bent arms with their weight, heavy silver platters of roasted meats balanced carefully before the eyes of guests. The slaves walking slowly, carefully, sweating under the strain, but never allowed to show weakness or stumble, for the humiliation of failing before the master's peers brought punishments, swift and severe. Even in temples or public works, carrying was demanded of slaves. For processions required altars and statues to be lifted on poles and borne across streets, the bearers straining under divine images that weighed heavily but were expected to be carried with grace and reverence, their pain hidden behind masks of solemn duty, while in ports and marketplaces, slaves carried cargo from ship to shore, from cart to stall, the endless movement of goods across the empire flowing on their shoulders, their bent backs, the hidden foundation of Roman trade, the strain of hauling shaped bodies into tools, broadening shoulders, thickening arms, hardening feet, yet also wearing them down, crushing spines, leaving joints swollen, cooked, and creating a lifetime of pain that no rest could cure. For when one day ended, another began with the same demands, the same burdens, the same overseer shouting commands that drowned out the groans of those who labored. Hauling and carrying were not skills praised or honored, but necessities assumed, invisible until they failed, and then punished with harshness that ensured failure was never repeated. But the true weight was not only in the loads themselves, but in the knowledge that no burden was ever final, that even when one amphora was set down, another awaited. Even when one sack of grain was delivered, another stood ready. Even when one log was stacked, the pile was never finished, and the cycle went on, endless, as if the very empire demanded that slaves themselves become beasts of burden, living carriers of its wealth, its comforts, its power, their sweat soaking into every stone, every harvest, every drop of water and oil that sustained Roman life. The marketplace in a Roman town was not merely a place of exchange, but the beating heart of daily life. And for the slaves who were sent there on errands, it was a world of relentless noise, ceaseless movement, and constant demands that pressed upon the mind as heavily as burdens pressed upon the back. For the market was never quiet, never calm, never orderly. but instead a storm of shouts, clatter, laughter, bargaining, and the grating din of voices competing against one another in a space where everything from grain to livestock to fine silks might be bought, sold, or argued over. And into this confusion the slave was thrust each day, a nameless figure with a master's list or a master's coin, expected to navigate the chaos with speed, accuracy, and obedience. From the moment one stepped into the forum or the crowded stalls along narrow streets, the senses were assaulted, first by the cries of merchants who shouted their wares with practiced rhythm, each calling louder than the next, fishermen crying out the freshness of their catch with voices rough from salt air, butchers slapping cuts of meat upon tables to show their red gleam, bakers announcing loaves still steaming from their ovens, cloth sellers unfurling bright dyed fabrics with sharp snaps of their wrists, while fruit vendors raised baskets of figs, olives, or pomegranates high into the air as if the sight of abundance itself might draw a buyer from the throng. The air itself was thick with smells, pleasant and foul alike, the sweetness of honeyed cakes drifting across the stench of slaughtered animals, the sharp tang of vinegar mingling with the rank odor of fish laid on open boards beneath the sun, smoke from roasting meats curling into the dust kicked up by hundreds of sandaled feet, all of it mixing into a haze that clung to hair, skin, clothed them, until one carried the market's imprint back home, unable to wash it fully away. The sound, however, was what truly overwhelmed. For it was not merely voices, but the endless layering of voices upon voices, a cacophony of bargaining that never ceased, a rhythm of offers and refusals, of merchants lowering prices with feigned reluctance, of buyers groaning at costs and threatening to walk away, of laughter when tricks succeeded, of anger when cheating was caught, all against the constant background hum of conversation, footsteps, and the clink of coins being counted and exchanged. Slaves sent to buy goods had to push through this storm, balancing amphorae, baskets, or sacks, their ears straining to catch the prices, their eyes watching for the best quality, their minds remembering each item ordered by the master, for a mistake could mean not only wasted coin, but also punishment at home. And so, the noise was not simply distracting, but dangerous. Every shout a pull at attention, every sudden offer a temptation to error, every quick bargain a test of loyalty and memory. Merchants, too, treated slaves differently, some shouting directly into their ears, pressing goods upon them in hopes of an easy sale, others dismissing them with scorn, demanding proof of whose household they belonged to before even allowing them to touch the wares, still others attempting to cheat with lighter measures or spoiled goods. Knowing that a slave could be beaten for failing to notice, but could do little to protest in the moment. Meanwhile, the clamor was not only from buying and selling, but from animals driven through the streets, oxen bellowing as carts rattled across stones, donkeys braying beneath heavy loads, chickens clucking wildly from wicker cages, dogs barking and darting between legs, the bleating of goats and sheep adding to the chorus, and the creaking of wooden wheels and yokes joining the sound, so that silence became impossible. Conversation became shouting, and every word fought against the din to be heard. Children added their shrieks and laughter as they chased each other through alleys. Beggars cried out for alms with voices hoarse from hunger. Street performers pounded drums, played flutes, or clashed cymbals to draw eyes to their tricks, and public criers raised their voices even louder to announce decrees, legal notices, or upcoming games. Their proclamations nearly drowned in the sea of sound that surged around them. The slave tasked with shopping not only endured this, but had to carry it within the overwhelming pressure of noise turning thoughts sluggish. Each step a negotiation through bodies that pressed from all sides, men shouting, women haggling, hands waving, coins clinking, the whole space alive with an intensity that never truly dimmed. Not even when the sun burned at its height and shadows disappeared from the stones. For the market never ceased until darkness forced stalls to close. And yet, amid the noise, there were rhythms that could be recognized. The early morning rush, when bakers sold bread, warm and steaming. When fishermen shouted most eagerly to prove the catch was fresh. When farmers with carts full of vegetables sought to sell before the heat spoiled their produce. The mid-morning swell, when wealthy households sent slaves with larger purses, their presence drawing merchants to call more loudly. The afternoon thinning as the best goods were gone, leaving cheaper, rougher remains for the poor. And finally, the late-day scramble, when prices dropped and shouting grew desperate. Bargains struck over what was nearly unsellable. The noise, changing tone from confidence to urgency to exhaustion. For slaves, each of these moments carried its own weight. Each hour its own demands, and the noise was the constant through it all, shaping memory so that even when they returned home with baskets filled and shoulders sore, the echoes of the market seemed to ring in their ears, the shouts lingering like ghosts long after they left the stones behind. To live as a Roman slave was to endure not only the weight of labor, but also the noise of life itself. And nowhere was that noise louder, harsher, or more overwhelming than in the markets, where the empire's wealth, hunger, and power converged. In sound, and where the slave was both invisible within the crowd, and yet always marked, always measured, always reminded through the noise that their task was not to join in, but to serve. To listen, to obey, and to carry the market's chaos home in silence. Within the walls of the Roman city, behind the noise of markets and the grandeur of temples, there existed another world, less visible, yet equally vital, the world of the workshops, where slaves labored from dawn until exhaustion, their sweat and skill shaping the goods that sustained the empire. And in these spaces, the rhythm of life was not determined by the sun or the seasons, but by the endless demand of production. The hammer striking metal, the wheel spinning clay, the loom pulling thread, the chisel biting into wood or stone, and, at the center of it all, always, the bodies of slaves bending, straining, and enduring in silence. A Roman workshop was never a place of leisure, but rather a crucible of constant activity, filled with heat, noise, dust, and the heavy air of labor. And the slaves inside were expected to serve with precision and endurance, whether they were smiths hammering iron into plowshares or nails, potters shaping clay into amphorae, weavers twisting fibers into cloth, leatherworkers curing hides into sandals or belts, carpenters shaping beams into furniture, or builders preparing mortars and stone for construction. And in each craft the demand was the same: endless repetition, unwavering attention, no room for error. The clang of metal upon metal in the blacksmith's corner rang ceaselessly, echoing against the walls until the very air seemed to vibrate with the rhythm. Sparks flying as hammers struck glowing iron on anvils, the heat of the forge searing, smoke rising from bellows that were worked by slave hands too weary to count the hours, yet still required to keep the flames alive. In another part of the workshop, the potter's slaves sat hunched before wheels, their hands coated with clay, spinning vessel after vessel, their backs aching from the posture, their arms heavy from the repetition. And though each pot or jar might seem to be a simple item, the master demanded uniformity. And so, every curve, every rim, every handle had to match. A task that left little room for expression or error, and yet even the smallest crack or flaw meant punishment or the lash. The weavers endured another form of servitude, their days defined by the endless clicking of the loom, the constant back and forth of shuttles, the pulling of fibers into tight, even patterns, their eyes straining in dim light to ensure the threads did not tangle their fingers raw from contact with coarse fibers. The monotony broken only by the harsh command of overseers who demanded faster work, tighter cloth, greater output. The carpenters, too, worked without pause. Their workshops filled with the smell of sawdust and resin, the air punctuated by the rasp of files, the chop of axes, and the creak of timbers being joined. Each item measured not by beauty alone, but by function, and soul slaves crafted beds, stools, chests, or carts that would be sold in markets or used in households. Their labor invisible to those who purchased the finished goods, for the name of the slave was never recorded, only the coin, received by the master. In some workshops, the division of labor was so strict that slaves never saw the full product of their work, only the part assigned to them, one striking the shape, another smoothing, another decorating, until the object was complete, and each hand became only one link in a chain that never ended, the individual lost in the mass of labor. The noise of these spaces was relentless, for the sound of tools filled every corner, hammering, scraping, clattering, grinding, and above it the barked orders of overseers or the occasional shouted quarrel when tempers frayed under strain. But silence was rare, and when it came, it was heavy with exhaustion rather than peace. The smells, too, were distinct, harsh, and unrelenting. The acrid smoke of forges, the damp earth of clay, the pungent odor of curing leather, the sharp resin of wood, all of them blending into an atmosphere that clung to hair and clothing, branding the slaves with the scent of their labor. For those bound in workshops, life was not measured in days of freedom or seasons of harvest, but in tasks repeated endlessly, in quotas demanded, in hours stretched until strength was gone, and for many there was little hope of release, for the skills they carried made them too valuable to be spared, their bodies treated as tools, their craft belonging to the master who claimed their labor. In some workshops, the presence of free workers added another layer of strain. For slaves labored beside hired men, yet without pay, their toil judged more harshly, their mistakes punished more severely, their fatigue ignored, and in this proximity, they could see what freedom meant, yet could not grasp it. For women, workshop servitude carried its own burdens, as they were often confined to weaving, spinning, or preparing dyes. Their lives consumed by fibers and fabric, the constant pull of thread across weary hands, the heavy fumes of dyes staining fingers and clothing, their efforts praised only when the cloth sold for high price, their names never spoken. Even children were not spared. 4 young slaves were trained early, their small fingers set to weaving fine patterns, their nimble bodies set to tasks where adults could not fit. Their childhoods consumed not by play, but by the endless repetition of work. And yet, within these spaces of toil, there existed a strange, grim rhythm, for the slaves came to know each other's breaths, the pace of hammers, the measure of wheels, the tempo of looms, and their lives, though harsh, moved with the cadence of shared labor, a rhythm that shaped them as surely as the tools shaped the goods. When the day ended, if it ended, the slaves left not to rest, but to collapse, their muscles stiff, their lungs coated with dust or smoke, their ears ringing with echoes of noise, their hands still twitching with the memory of tools, and in sleep. If sleep came, dreams were filled with the same motions they had performed by day. It's the endless spinning, hammering, weaving, carving, until labor and life were indistinguishable. The workshops of Rome were, in truth, prisons without walls, places where the empire's wealth was forged by the invisible hands of slaves. And the servitude within them was not dramatic with spectacle, but grinding, steady, and consuming, reducing lives in 2 cycles of work, stripping identities until all that remained was the labor itself. And in this ceaseless toil, the true weight of bondage was felt most keenly, not in chains alone, but in the endless shaping of goods that would pass into other hands, while the makers themselves remained unseen, unheard, and unfree. Among the many duties that consumed the lives of Roman slaves, few were as demanding, repetitive, and yet so invisible as the tasks of tending to the baths and the daily comforts of their masters. For the Roman world was built upon a love of ritual, cleanliness, bodily care, and relaxation. And while the elite spoke proudly of the civilizing power of the bath, of its warmth, its steam, and its luxurious repose, was the slave who toiled endlessly in silence to make such comfort possible. And without them, the marble chambers and steaming pools would have stood empty, for hot water does not heat itself, perfumes do not appear by magic, and towels do not fold and dry without weary hands to manage them. The great bathhouses of Rome, known as thermae, were monuments of civic pride, vast complexes of stone and marble filled with chambers for hot, warm, and cold bathing. But to the slave, these were not places of leisure, but of relentless labor. For long before a patron entered, the day's work had already begun in the subterranean levels where fires were kept alive. The hypocaust furnaces, roaring with flames, fed constantly by slaves whose arms were blackened with soot, their skin blistered from the heat, their lungs filled with smoke, and their task never ending. For the fires could not be allowed to die, lest the waters cool and the masters complain. The heating of water required a chain of labor, slaves stoking fires, hauling fuel, carrying water from cisterns, and ensuring that the right pools were warmed to the proper temperature, all under the watch of overseers who demanded precision and speed. For a nobleman who entered the caldarium expected steaming water and would accept no excuses for discomfort. Above ground, other slaves prepared the bathing spaces, sweeping floors of marble, scrubbing the benches, arranging oils, perfumes, strigils, the curved metal tools used to scrape sweat and dirt from the skin, and ensuring that every vessel, every jar, every towel was in place before the first visitor arrived. And though this work might seem light compared to hauling in the fields or hammering in a forge, it was constant, meticulous, and performed under the gaze of those who would notice even the smallest lapse. As patrons entered, slaves became attendants, moving quietly yet swiftly, helping their masters disrobe, folding garments, holding jewelry, and guarding possessions, while the bathers descended into the ritual of bathing, and here the servitude deepened, for slaves were expected not only to prepare, but to touch, to scrape sweat and oil from skin, to pour water from vessels over tired shoulders, to massage muscles with practiced hands, their own bodies reduced to extensions of comfort. For others, many were trained to apply oils with steady pressure, to rub fatigue from limbs, to stand ready with clean towels, and to anticipate needs before words were spoken. For a master expected obedience, not in response, but in foresight, and a slave who failed to predict the next desire was judged harshly. The intimacy of this service stripped away the last boundary of personal dignity, for a slave was made to handle the very bodies of those who owned them, to kneel, to touch, to scrape, to press, to obey in silence, their own weariness swallowed while they served. The baths were not quiet places, but alive with echoes, with splashing water, with voices rising in conversation, with laughter, argument, and debate. Yet, for the slaves, its noise was only the backdrop to ceaseless motion, rushing to refill vessels, to fetch cloths, to replace items, to sweep floors damp with water. Their work constant, even as their presence was ignored. Beyond the public bathhouses, in the villas and townhouses of the wealthy, the same rituals unfolded on a smaller scale, and there too slaves bore the burden, for private baths had their own fires, apace, their own chambers, and their own requirements. And in these intimate spaces, the labor was perhaps more relentless, for fewer hands meant heavier demands upon each individual, and a master's comfort relied entirely upon the invisible toil of those below. The role of tending to comfort extended beyond bathing itself, for slaves were tasked with perfumes, with arranging couches for repose, with ensuring that water for drinking or for washing was always at hand, with managing linens so that no master ever lacked a fresh cloth or garment, and with creating an atmosphere of ease that concealed the ceaseless activity behind it. For luxury is never effortless. It is constructed upon labor, and in Rome, that labor was slave labor. Even the smallest details required care. The scent of oil infused with herbs, the exact warmth of water poured from bronze ewers, the cleanliness of combs and brushes, the careful keeping of ivory boxes for cosmetics or ointments, each one attended to by slaves whose work was only noticed when it faltered. For women of the household, the role of bathing in comfort often included the elaborate rituals of grooming, hairdressing, and adornment. And here, too, slaves bore the weight, standing for hours as they combed, braided, curled, or pinned hair into complex arrangements, their fingers aching while they obeyed every instruction, and their failures punished with harsh words or blows if the result displeased. For the men, masseurs and bath attendants were often chosen for strength and endurance, expected to need weary muscles after a long day, to stretch limbs, to scrape sweat, and to remain at hand until dismissed, their own fatigue irrelevant. The world of the baths, though often remembered in history for its marble beauty and social gatherings, was in truth sustained by a hidden army of slaves, whose backs bent, whose hands blistered, whose bodies absorbed heat and cold so that others might feel only warmth and ease. When the day's bathers departed, when the voices faded and the marble floor stood wet and silent, the slaves did not rest, for then came the final labor. Cleaning pools, draining excess water, gathering towels, scrubbing surfaces, and preparing once more for the next day. The cycle endless, the comfort of others dependent on their exhaustion. To tend to baths and comforts was to live in a world of constant readiness, of anticipating needs, of erasing discomfort before it could be felt by the master. And in this way, the servitude was not always loud with commands, but heavy with expectation. The silence of watching eyes often more oppressive than the lash. In truth, the Roman love of bathing, of oil, of comfort, was built upon the unseen suffering of those whose names were never recorded, whose labor was never praised, and whose presence was forgotten as soon as the water cooled. And in this silence, the reality of bondage was most clearly revealed. For the comfort of one rested entirely upon the toil of another, a cycle unbroken, repeated day after day, until lives were consumed in service, and the empire's greatness was warmed, perfumed, and softened by the hands of its slaves. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the Roman world shifted from the bustle of day to the rituals of evening, the duties of slaves did not diminish, but instead lengthened into a new rhythm of obligation. For in a household of wealth, the night was no time of rest, but rather a time of careful preparation, of serving, of waiting, and of endless tasks that stretched far beyond the patience of the weary body, yet demanded perfect composure and silence, because the comfort of the master and his family had to be preserved without interruption. The long evening duties began even before darkness fell, for slaves were expected to anticipate the transition, lighting the lamps that lined the atrium and peristyle, carrying oil in bronze vessels, trimming the wicks, and ensuring that the glow was steady but not smoky, filling the rooms with a soft, controlled light that signaled order rather than chaos, because a house poorly lit reflected badly upon the master. Others were busy preparing the evening meal, and though the kitchens had been aflame since dawn, the supper, known as the cena, was the centerpiece of the day's domestic life, a lengthy affair that required the coordination of many hands, from the cooks stirring pots and roasting meats, to the servers arranging dishes, to the cupbearers polishing vessels of silver and glass. And when guests were invited, the labor multiplied, with slaves running from storerooms to kitchens, from kitchens to dining rooms, and from dining rooms back again, carrying platters, refilling cups, and presenting dishes in the proper order. Their motions, constant, precise, and closely observed. The dining chamber itself became a theater of service, where every movement of a slave was meant to be invisible, yet flawless. Pouring wine into cups without spilling a drop, cutting bread evenly, laying dishes before the guests with bowed heads, and responding instantly to hand gestures, for to hesitate was to invite ridicule, and ridicule was often followed by punishment. Behind this scene of abundance and leisure, the weight of labor was immense. For after serving, slaves had to retreat quickly to prepare the next course, to wash vessels, to fetch more wine, or to manage the flow of food so that the master's table was never bare, while others stood silently in the background, waiting for commands that might come suddenly or not at all. In the stillness of their waiting was as much a part of their bondage as the work itself. When the dining finally ended, the night did not end, as then began the slow task of clearing, gathering the remains of the feast, washing dishes, scrubbing floors where wine had spilled or food had fallen, and folding away the linens, so that the house returned to order before the dawn could reveal disorder. For to wake to a messy home was unthinkable in a household that prized discipline. Meanwhile, within the private chambers of the family, slaves were called upon to assist in the rituals of personal care before bed, preparing basins of water for washing, holding lamps to guide their masters through dim hallways, bringing in warmed cloths, oils, and combs, arranging bedding, and sometimes reading aloud to their owners if such entertainment was desired. Their voices required to be calm and steady, even if their own throats ached with fatigue. For women, attendants spent long hours undoing elaborate hairstyles, carefully removing pins, combing out tangles, folding garments, and storing jewelry, their hands trembling with exhaustion, but forbidden to falter, because a broken comb or tangled braid could bring harsh reprimand even at such a late hour. The duties of the evening stretched further still, because while some slaves tended directly to the family, others moved quietly through the house to ensure security, closing shutters, checking doors, or standing guard at the gates, their eyes heavy with sleeplessness, but their vigilance demanded, because theft or intrusion would not fall upon the master's conscience, but upon the slave's back. Beyond the villa or townhouse, in urban Rome, the long evening duties might include escorting the master or his guests home after a dinner, carrying torches through darkened streets, or waiting outside while merry-making stretched into the late hours, their presence required until dismissal, queen, which might come deep into the night, leaving them only a handful of hours before dawn duties began again. For some, the burden was more humiliating still, for the evening hours were also when certain slaves were expected to provide companionship of another kind. Bodies used as readily as vessels or towels, their role in the household reduced not only to labor but to servitude of the most intimate and degrading nature. And though this, too, was part of the unspoken weight of night, it was hidden behind the polished facade of Roman respectability. When the household at last grew quiet, when the lamps burned low and voices faded into sleep, the slaves did not collapse into rest. For many remained on call, sleeping lightly in corners of hallways or near the doorways of their masters, ready to rise at the sound of a summons, because in bondage there was no guarantee of uninterrupted rest. Only a cycle of waiting and serving, of silence and fatigue. The long evening duties were not measured in a single task, but in the endurance of countless small tasks strung together without pause, so that the night itself became another form of labor, consuming strength meant for rest, draining the body for the next day's burdens, and teaching the slave that life was not lived for the self, but for the unending needs of others. In the grand halls of Rome, where laughter and music filled the evenings. The true music was the shuffle of weary feet carrying dishes, the clink of vessels being washed, the whisper of hands folding linens, and the quiet exhaustion of voices speaking only in obedience. And though history remembers the feasts, the banquets, and the brilliance of Roman evenings, it was built upon the invisible weight of those whose names were never recorded, whose evenings were not hours of leisure, but chains of duty that stretched until sleep could no longer be resisted, and even then, only for a few hours before the next dawn's demands began anew. When the sun had fully set and the last rays of daylight had slipped away, the long evening duties of the household continued with a rhythm that was as demanding as it was endless. For even though the world outside grew still and the streets quieted into shadows within the villa or townhouse, the lives of slaves remained tethered to constant expectation, their tasks unbroken by time, because night for their masters was not a retreat into silence, but a transition into comfort, ritual, and the pursuit of leisure, all of which required invisible labor to sustain. The lamps that had been lit earlier needed constant tending, for olive oil burned unevenly, wicks charred and shortened, and the glow could falter unless slaves carefully trimmed, refilled, and adjusted them, moving silently from room to room, with small tools and jars of oil, making sure that light remained steady and pleasing, because smoke, flickering shadows, or dim rooms reflected negligence, and negligence was never excused. In the kitchens, where the heat of the day lingered long after the final dishes had been carried out, slaves remained busy, washing, scrubbing, and arranging food stores for the next day, because bread had to be prepared for baking in the morning, meats preserved in salt, and wine vessels checked so that nothing spoiled before dawn. For a master could not wait to find a kitchen in disorder. Those serving in the dining room, though the feast had ended, still bore heavy responsibilities, gathering cups, wiping down reclining couches, sweeping the floors of crumbs, and removing the last traces of disorder, their work extending far into the night, while laughter and music still echoed faintly from the triclinium, reminding them that even in exhaustion they remained tethered to the lingering pleasures of their owners. In private chambers, the pace of evening duties shifted from the noise of banquets to the intimacy of service, where slaves attended their masters in quieter ways, bringing basins of warm water for washing tired hands and feet, laying out fresh linens, folding away discarded garments, and preparing the bedding with care, smoothing every wrinkle so that rest would not be disturbed. For even the slightest imperfection could be seen as disrespect or incompetence. For women of the household, attendants had to spend long, careful hours undoing the day's elaborate hairstyles, removing pins and ornaments one by one, combing out tangles without pulling too hard, and arranging the hair to rest comfortably for the night, all while folding and storing garments of fine cloth, placing jewelry back into chests, and ensuring that perfumes, oils, and cosmetic tools were neatly arranged for the morning. A task that often demanded both precision and patience, even when hands trembled with fatigue. The younger slaves, often children, were not spared from these evening routines, for they were expected to fetch items quickly, hold lamps steady in dim corridors, or run errands from room to room while older slaves remained with the masters. And their small bodies often moved until exhaustion forced them to collapse onto whatever corner or step they were allowed to rest on. Because in the Roman household, age did not excuse duty. Some slaves, especially those of learning or talent, were tasked with reading aloud to their owners in the late hours, reciting poetry, philosophy, or letters. Their voices required to be steady and unbroken, even if their eyes blurred with tiredness, and their minds begged for silence, while others played instruments softly to accompany the fading hours, the music soothing the ears of the wealthy, but tightening the chains of the weary. The burdens of the evening stretched beyond the walls of the house. For in urban Rome, slaves were often expected to escort their masters to late banquets or return with them from feasts, carrying torches to light their way, standing guard at carriages, or waiting in cold streets until dismissal came, which could be deep into the night, meaning they would return home only to face the first duties of dawn, with little to no rest. In the countryside, evening duties could also mean tending to the animals once more, ensuring that barns were secured, that feed was not left exposed, and that predators had not come too close, because negligence here risked not only punishment, but real loss for the estate. And so, slaves dragged their tired bodies once more into fields or stables before finally retreating to their quarters. For some, the long evening was also a time of humiliation, for they were expected to provide companionship or personal service of the most intimate kind. Their bodies commanded as if they were no different from tools or furniture, and though this burden was cloaked in silence and hidden behind the respectable image of Roman order, it was a reality that deepened the misery of the night. When at last the masters and their families closed their eyes, the slaves' duties did not end because they had to remain nearby. Some sleeping lightly on mats outside chamber doors, others stationed at gates to guard against intrusion, or left to watch over fires and lamps to prevent accidents, their rest always shallow, broken, and never secure, for a single call or sound could summon them into action again. The long evening duties, then, were not a list of tasks easily completed, but an endless chain of obligations, each one linked to the comfort of the master, each one pressing further against the body's need for rest, and each one reminding the slave that his or her life was not their own, but only an extension of another's will. In these hours of quiet servitude, when Rome's elite enjoyed the softness of their couches and the calm of their private chambers, the true rhythm of the household was kept alive by unseen hands, hands that moved constantly, tirelessly, without thanks or recognition, ensuring that disorder never touched the lives of the free. And though history remembers the brilliance of Roman evenings, the banquets, the laughter, and the elegance of leisure, beneath it all was the ceaseless motion of labor, the long evening duties that turned night itself into another burden of daylight, stealing from slaves the peace of sleep, and replacing it with silence, service, and exhaustion so deep that even dreams offered no escape, only the anticipation of the next dawn and the endless cycle that began again. When at last the night deepened into its stillest hours and the voices of masters fell silent behind closed doors, the slaves who had carried the burdens of the entire day found themselves finally permitted to step back into the narrow margins of their own existence. And though their bodies ached and their minds throbbed with the memory of endless commands, the quiet of night offered them a fragile moment of reprieve, a pause not given as a gift, but seized as the only space left to breathe. The household, so alive with motion during the hours of daylight and evening, grew hushed. The clamor of markets far away, the feasts long ended, the instruments put away, and the only sounds that remained were the faint crackle of lamps, the occasional creak of timber as the house settled, and the muffled rustle of footsteps from those still on guard duty near the gates or stationed outside the sleeping chambers. For the majority, however, the night signaled the slow retreat into the slave quarters. Those cramped, dimly lit spaces tucked behind kitchens, beneath staircases, or in shadowed corners of the villa. Never grand, never spacious, but simply functional, enough to contain bodies that had already been drained of strength. Here they would gather, not in laughter or comfort, but in weariness, lowering themselves onto mats of straw or rough boards, wrapping thin cloaks around their shoulders to keep out the night chill, and exhaling in heavy silence, because even words felt like labor after such a day. Yet, within that silence, there was a kind of unspoken understanding, a recognition that all shared the same exhaustion, the same chains of duty, the same narrow release found only in these late hours. And though they did not speak it aloud, this mutual suffering formed its own bond, fragile but undeniable. A bond that history often forgets, yet one that gave the enslaved a faint measure of endurance. Some used these moments to tend quickly to their own small needs, eating a crust of leftover bread kept hidden from earlier meals, sipping from a jar of diluted wine passed between weary hands, or rubbing oil into sore joints and cracked skin to ease the day's toll, while others simply fell where they stood, sleep dragging them into darkness before they could even settle their limbs. For the youngest, these hours carried the small mercy of dreams, though even those were restless, haunted by the memory of punishments, the weight of tasks left unfinished, or the dread of dawn's return. God, but still they dreamed, for it was the only space in which they could escape the unyielding rhythm of commands. In the countryside, nightfall carried with it different sounds, the lowing of animals settling into rest, the distant bark of dogs, the chirping of insects weaving their endless chorus beneath the stars, and slaves there too lay down, not in peace but in necessity, their bodies too tired to resist the pull of sleep, their ears still attuned to the smallest call or threat that might demand their waking. In the city, the air was never entirely silent. For Rome's streets were alive even at night, echoing with drunken laughter, the rattle of carts, or the muffled calls of watchmen. And yet, within the slave quarters, those noises blurred into the background, becoming nothing more than the hum of a world that continued to turn regardless of their suffering. And still, even at night, not all could rest. For some slaves remained bound to duty, tasked with guarding doors, patrolling halls, keeping lamps lit, or waiting outside their master's chamber in case of sudden needs, their eyes heavy, their bodies swaying, but their minds forced awake by fear of punishment. And so, for them, nightfall was no true rest, but simply another shift in the unending cycle of service. Yet, for those permitted to lie down, the closing of eyes brought the closest thing to freedom they would ever know. A freedom not of choice, but of release, where exhaustion overcame pain and silence overcame command, and in those fragile hours of sleep, their bodies stitched together where little strength could be found before the dawn demanded it all again. Night was not an end, not a reward, not a kindness, but it was at least a pause, and in that pause there was a faint sweetness. For no master's voice could intrude upon a dream, no whip could strike in the realm of sleep, and no order could bend the body that had slipped into the refuge of unconsciousness. Across the empire, in villas and farms, in cities and provinces, the story was the same. Countless men and women, boys and girls, their names forgotten, their lives unrecorded, finding their only comfort in the stillness of night, holding within them a strength that went unpraised, enduring another day only to face the certainty of the next, yet still closing their eyes because rest, however brief, was the only shield against despair. And so the night stretched on, hour by hour, stars tracing their patient paths overhead, and the slaves of Rome, weary beyond words, lay scattered in their corners, finally allowed the smallest measure of what all humans crave, the chance to rest, to let the weight of the world slip from their shoulders for a fleeting time before the relentless sun rose again. Their story, like the day itself, ended not in triumph, but in silence, not in freedom, but in surrender to sleep, and in that surrender was a dignity of its own. For even the most burdened of souls must one day close their eyes. And with that, dear listener, as the final lamps dim and the echoes of footsteps fade into quiet, let us leave this long journey through the life of labor in ancient Rome and step too into the stillness of rest. For the night has come, the duties have ended, and sleep calls gently upon us all. Good good night.